In Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. On this podcast special, we're sharing two segments. First, Comrade Malik, state name Keith Washington, of the IWW and Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, speaks about his experience at the federal prison USP Pollock in Grant Parish, Louisiana, and about changes in policies in relation to the pandemic and the dangers posed by guards going in and out of the facilities. Comrade Malik was paroled from the Texas prison system some months ago and is now serving the remains of a 9-month federal sentence before release to California, where he plans to work on the SF Bayview National Black newspaper. More of Malik's writings can be found at comrademalik.com. He also requests that listeners press the Bureau of Prisons to release Malik to the address in San Francisco that he now has on file with the BOP. Comrade Malik is in his 50s and has a history of medical issues thanks to maltreatment by the Texas prison system. And this is a serious point of danger considering the COVID outbreaks. You can contact USP Pollock via email at capital P, capital O, capital L, / capital EXEC, capital A, assistant. That's POL / exec assistant at bop.gov, or by phone at 318-561-5300. You can also call the head of the office of the BOP at 202-307-3198 to register a similar request, and those numbers will be in our show notes. Then we hear from author and anarchist Peter Gelderloos about responses by the Spanish government and the civil society in Spain to the pandemic, challenges to internationalizing rent refusal, and a challenge to treat people better in our communities. More of his writing can be found at theanarchistlibrary.org. Stay tuned for Sunday's episode with housing organizers in Asheville from about the work they're doing here and suggestions about organizing, as well as a chat with a volunteer doing harm reduction on the actions of local police and politicians against houseless folks and drug users, and the shutdown of life-saving programs during the pandemic. Just a quick announcement of some phone zaps beginning today about prisons in the so-called US and the COVID-19 virus. You can find the numbers and the demands compiled in our show notes. First off, there's a phone zap starting today, April 9th, for Lee State Prison in Georgia, where 2 deaths have occurred from COVID-19. Atlanta iWalk suggests styling *67 to block your number before making calls, and has a few other ways that they would suggest keeping yourself safer while dialing prisons and administration. In North Carolina, Federal Correctional Complex at Butner, operated by the BOP, was reported to have 59 cases of COVID-19 just a few days before this was recorded. Outbreaks have also been reported by state prisons Caledonia CI, Greene CI, and Johnston CI, all operated by the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. There's an ongoing phone zap that can be found up at brabc.blackblogs.org, also linked in our show notes. About 10 inmates at the North Lake Correctional Facility, a federal immigrant prison in Baldwin, Michigan, are moving into day 5 of a hunger strike, demanding adequate nutrition and basic health care services currently being denied, as well as religious freedom for the followers of the Hebrew Israelite faith. A call script and numbers can be found at itsgoingdown.org, also linked in our show notes. And finally, Spire City Medics is blasting a zap to press Sheriff Chuck Jenkins in Frederick County, Maryland, to release prisoners and ICE detainees in light of the pandemic and a lack of preparation for the safety of those housed in the jail there. More information is at spirecitymedics.org. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. More info about CZN can be found at channelzeronetwork.com.
COVID-19 has exposed the many failings of states around the globe. Millions have lost their jobs, leaving many unable to pay rent and in danger of eviction. In response, tenants around the world organized rent strikes for April 1. As the crisis continues, even more people will fall short of rent. More rent strikes will begin May 1 and maybe even June 1. If you're worried about making rent now or in the future, it's time to get organized. Reach out to your neighbors, find your local tenants union, and let the landlords know you won't be paying rent. Then fly a white sheet from your window to spread the message. Channel Zero Network podcasts have put out several episodes on tenant struggles surrounding COVID-19. Check out Rebel Steps' emergency rent strike episode for ways to get started. It's Going Down's episode This is America, number 111 and 112 for interviews with organizers, and the Final Straws episode Doing for Selves to hear from Tenants United in Chicago, and Crime Thinks, the Ex-Worker podcast, episode 75 for an overview of rent strike tactics and history. Even though we don't know what the future holds, we do know that stronger communities are the way to ensure a better world for all of us. We can build those communities one person at a time, building by building, block by block. Be ready to join the movement on May 1.
COVID-19 update. USP Pollock, Louisiana, by Keith Malik, Washington, Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. Peace and blessings, sisters and brothers. Today is April 2nd, 2020. I am delivering my COVID-19 update from inside USP Pollock, which is located in Pollock, Louisiana, near the city of Alexandria. For those who have been following my updates, you have already confirmed the death of a prisoner housed at our sister facility, SCI Oakdale, Louisiana. Our prayers and condolences are extended to the family members and loved ones of our fallen comrade. On April 1st, 2020, I woke up to more restrictive modified operations here at USP Pollock, as well as a rumor being circulated of one BOP employee and one prisoner here at USP Pollock suspected of having contracted the COVID-19 virus. Thus far, this is just an inmate rumor. Many, I must ask for your help in contacting the complex warden, Chris McConnell, in order to ascertain the validity of this rumor. It wouldn't be surprising that someone here had contracted the virus. BOP employees are allowed to come and go daily in and out of the SEC complex at Pollock. Sisters and brothers, the number one carriers and transmitters of the coronavirus here at USP Pollock will be BOP employees. Thus far, all officers are screened before entering the facility, and they are asked to self-report any suspected contacts they may have had with high-risk persons. We, the prisoners at USP Pollock, continue to be subjected to ever-increasing restrictions, yet the employees come and go as they please. There are numerous open cells here at USP Pollock, and there are numerous empty units. We propose that officers assigned to the housing units begin to stay here on the unit rather than leave the facility daily. This may sound like a drastic measure, but please understand, comrades, drastic times require drastic measures. The state of Louisiana is number 2 in deaths per capita from the COVID-19 virus. Prisons, by design, are a super confined environment, and once the coronavirus is introduced to the prison population, it will spread like wildfire. As we have seen with SCI Oakdale, death is an inevitable consequence from COVID-19 infections within the confined federal prison environment. Early on in this report, I mentioned that the BOP has initiated more restrictive modified operations here at USP Pollock. For clarification's sake, let me say that these new restrictive measures are now system-wide. Here at USP Pollock, only 8 cells are allowed on the flats at one time. Previously, 16 cells were allowed out for 2 hours a day in order to allow prisoners access to phones, emails, and showers. The cells here at USP Pollock are designed to house 2 people. In light of these new restrictions, I will only be allowed out of my cell every other day, so my access to the phone, email, and shower will be cut in half. On its face, these new measures are an attempt by the BOP to adhere more closely to CDC recommendations for social distancing, as well as limiting the amount of prisoners allowed out of their cells at one time. It is imperative that I highlight once again that most of my fellow prisoners here are healthy. Our risk to COVID-19 infection comes from BOP employees and not each other. Please understand this point. In closing, I report that yesterday, on April 1st, 2020, my case manager, Mr. Carter, had me sign my application for federal halfway house and the transfer of my primary address to San Francisco, California. I ask all of you, once again, to please contact the Bureau of Prisons and strongly encourage them to release me to my primary release address, which is the address for the San Francisco Bayview National Black newspaper, or release me to federal halfway house as soon as possible. With your support, my transition
Here's a track from anarchist hip-hop artist Time to uplift you a little bit. This is I Wrote This to Start a Fire from his new album, These Songs Kill Fascists.
I wrote this to start a fire. I wrote this in memory of Hannah Hire. Fire starter, throwing kerosene on the coals. For the white rose, rest in peace to Sophie Scholl. This for liberatic, who fight against the fascists. The idolized pirate said, take this day to smash it. The swing kids as I zoom and zoo suit jackets, along with the slurs who wanted Nazis and trash pits. I wrote this for Emma, who lit my soul's inner flame. This is for Ida, who taught us how to liberate. 43 group in the battle of Cable Street, who fought fascists in London, blood left their faces street. We rock against racism like the X-ray specs. We're looking for liberation, not paychecks. From Charlottesville to the Valley of Harama, I thought Killjoy told you there's no Nazis in Valhalla.
We never think about Heather but what we laugh or smile, because she often made people laugh. We love the sound of her laugh. A lot of us have videotapes.
We don't all have to sacrifice our lives. They tried to kill my child to shut her up. Well, guess what? You just magnified her.
Fascism is not to be debated, it is to be destroyed. The reason cops are hated is cause the clan they employ. From the Trail of Tears to the streets of Ferguson, from Rikers to Pelican Bay, the state we murdering. We're kicking fascists like St. Pauli, like when Ethiopia fought them with Holly. Lessons learned from Robeson to Chairman Fred. Solidarity, not charity, like Common Ground said. Just trying to find my way like LSA recluse. I'm looking for that strength that Ella Baker knew. Each bar is like John Brown cocking the hammer. We combat the propaganda like the breakfast from Panthers. It's for the CNT and the Mujeres Libres. I'm battling the state of myself, I'm in a fight this three-way. They should not pass, so pass around is what we say. A place of Killer P is what I'm telling the DJ.
I understood exactly what fascism was while I was there. And my intention was to go any place where I could help. I couldn't live with myself today if I hadn't gone there knowing what happened.
The neo-fascists had their own ammunition, and this is very important to keep in mind because the police, for the most part, pulled back. The next day, for example, of the 20 of us who were standing, many of them clergy, we would have been crushed like cockroaches if it were not for the anarchists and the anti-fascists who approached over 350 anti-fascists. We just had 20, and we singing this little light of mine. You know what I mean? So that
Antifa meaning anti-fascist.
The anti-fascists and the crucial the anarchists, because they saved our lives. Actually, we would.
Time also hosts an awesome podcast in the Channel Zero network, which you'll hear a jingle from right now.
I'm going to make those pompous academics regret kicking out such a genius. Deciding to build my lab and do my research.
The Time Talks Podcast.
Have you ever stared at a 500-page book and wish you could just talk to the author about their ideas instead? If so, the Time Talks Podcast, part of the Channel Zero network, is for you, where we discuss history, politics, music, and art with an anti-authoritarian and anarchist perspective.
The Time Talks Podcast.
What's this light? I feel different.
The Time Talks Podcast.
I'm speaking with anarchist author and iconoclastic firebrand Peter Gelderloos. How the heck are you?
I'm as well as I can be, I suppose. And over there?
Yeah, it's a shit show that's descending into fire, but very slowly where I'm living, thankfully. You've been living in Spain for quite a while, which has been suffering very high mortality rates from COVID-19. I'm wondering what the government response to the pandemic has been.
Well, to go back to the very beginning, first over the last 10 years, government, both left and then right-wing governments, have really decreased and underfunded public health care. So we have universal health care here. So in that sense, we have more of a safety net than in the U.S. But it's been defunded these last 10 years. So that's an important place to start from. The first death in the Spanish states was, if I'm remembering correctly, at the very beginning of March. And also all throughout the first 2 weeks of March, we had the example of Italy right next door, northern Italy, which was getting the classic case of a collapsed healthcare system, a huge amount of deaths that could have been prevented. And so, I mean, the first country, outside of China, to get a lot of cases of COVID-19, I suppose you could imagine it taking them longer to realize that this wasn't something that they're just going to see on the news, but this was a reality that was going to spread everywhere. And of course that case didn't exist in Spain since it was already happening in Italy. Nonetheless, they waited until the 13th of March to enact actually serious responses. They declared the state of emergency on the 13th of March. But of course, the government's idea of responses has a lot of distance from what an anarchist response might be, or what any kind of response that prioritizes health and well-being be. So they started with a lockdown, or quickly into a lockdown. There have been hundreds of people arrested, tens of thousands of people fined for going outside. Basically, you can go outside if you're going to a pharmacy, going to work if you have one of the jobs that's allowed to continue, or going to care for an elderly or sick relative. The police are asking for receipts. You're supposed to print out a paper or write out a permission slip. It's kind of like these weird. I mean, the whole critique of school, prison, hospital, and all that. It's like hall monitors with guns, which I guess also is already a thing that exists. But is a perfect example of what's senseless about that. Police have been fining people, and it's like a 600 to 1,200 euro fine, so up to $1,500, which is way more than most people make in a month. And they've been giving those fines, or if you talk back, arresting you when two people who live in the same house go out shopping together or go to take out the trash together. So the police measures are not at all calculated to practices that would actually that have anything to do with the spread of the virus. I mean, obviously, shelter in place, not carrying on with as usual. Of course, that's vital in the case of no argument there. But when they're punishing two people who are living in the same apartment, going out together, it's clearly just a rampant extension of police powers. They brought the military into the streets, of course, with the promise, in the media, what they were showing was, the military are going to help disinfect public areas, and they're going to make masks and stuff like that. Of course, the military very quickly got put into policing functions, arresting people, patrolling the streets and stuff like that. So there's that whole authoritarian aspect to what's going on. But admits that for the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, so we've just yesterday, it was 3 weeks of lockdown. So for the first 2 weeks, a huge number of completely non-essential job categories were still active. In the car factories in Spain, they only shut down the car factories after workers themselves started strike action, and plenty of other examples. Right here in the neighborhood where I live, we have a neighborhood assembly. We had to make a complaint to the building owners because somewhere around after 2 weeks of lockdown, so with huge numbers of new infections every day, of new deaths every day, sent some immigrant workers to change light bulbs in the stairways of the buildings. So something completely non-essential. We were talking to the workers. They're saying, if they don't work, they don't get paid. So they're just taking advantage of the absolute precarity of workers, forcing them to work in a situation of pandemic for completely non-essential things. It was only a week ago, the end of March, when the government increased the level of the state of emergency and forced more more job categories to shut down. So for 2 whole weeks, while the infection rates were skyrocketing, people were forced to go to work in completely pointless or non-urgent jobs, but you could get sent to jail if you walked outside and 2 people who shared the same apartment. Then there's also the economic question. So let's see, Spain. Population roughly 40 million. About almost 1 million people have been added to the unemployment rolls just during the duration of the emergency, and that's not counting a huge number of people who work without a contract, who have some kind of informal labor. That's my case. It's the case of a whole lot of other people who, of course, are not going to be included in the statistics. So amidst that, the government rescue package, of course, went to help people who have mortgages, houses. They went to help businesses. They went to help the bank and all that. But of course, no measures for rent until we already started spreading talk about the rent strike. So basically, on the political front, the measures have tended towards inefficient authoritarianism, and on the economic front towards, for the most part, protecting the people who have who already have the most in society.
How has the police and the military been? I mean, I'm sure I'm not going to be surprised by the answer to this question, but how have the military and police been engaging with folks that are houseless? Like, I remember years ago staying in Barcelona, and just, the city had a lot of folks who had come up from Africa or from West Asia or the Middle East, or from the Balkans or whatever, and they seemed to be staying pretty, their living situation seemed pretty precarious.
Yeah, it's definitely precarious. And the cities like Barcelona with a more progressive administration have been making noises about increasing capacity for homeless shelters. To a certain extent, that's true. Also, a lot of it is window dressing. There have also been, day centers that have been shut down in the midst of the pandemic, stuff like that. So a lot of the difference has been made up by direct action. There have been a number of cases of houses being opened up for folks without papers, for folks without houses. And then there's also a fair amount of collective self-defense by houseless people. A friend who lives in Barcelona was staying in touch with the folks who tend to live in a large park near their house, and so they were concerned, asking how those folks were doing, and their response was actually to sort of laugh and say that the police know not to mess with them. So in certain places, encampments of houseless people who, through solidarity, through self-defense, through collective violence, are actually able to create these sort of zones of exception within the state of exception, where the law doesn't have as much sway, and police know just not to go and mess with them. But then, of course, there are folks who are going to be more isolated, or just as individuals or individual families are going to be just completely at the mercy of the elements, the law, and the pandemic altogether. So it's a mixed bag.
You've talked a little bit about community-based direct action to alleviate some of the circumstances that people are experiencing under this. I'm wondering, one of the ways that I've been experiencing people talking about, and we'll go back to rent strike for sure, but experiencing pushing back and coming together in order to build alternatives to the failing support network that the state supposedly offers, has been mutual aid projects that pop up to sort of distribute goods and services while millions of working folks have been effectively kicked out of their ability to make money. Are there any notable responses where you are to the crisis of the state in this sort of way, or is that a model that seems specific in its organization and in its framing to the U.S.?
No, that's definitely something that's happening here. I live in a small city. There's a network of mutual groups here, including in our neighborhood. In a lot of small towns in Catalonia and definitely throughout other parts of the Spanish state, although I don't know of as many specific examples. There have also been mutual aid initiatives that have set up. Another friend in Barcelona told me that in just one neighborhood in Barcelona, there's actually 22 different mutual aid initiatives. So in a sense, that's, you know, something that might start as one mutual aid project that then decentralizes, so that in a larger neighborhood, you can have like different pockets or different nucleus. So that kind of decentralization, I think, is good, and specifically in the situation of a pandemic, because if you're creating a more central hub for mutual aid, for resource distribution, then of course you're opening up a big potential infection vector. And so this method of breaking it up into smaller groups that are much more localized to just a specific corner of the neighborhood, I think is a good response. So yeah, without a doubt, that's something that we're seeing here. Mutual aid networks that are distributing resources, food. Another thing that we've tried to focus on some of these has to do with mental health, and also specifically accompanying older friends, older comrades who are especially vulnerable to social isolation, for a variety of reasons, both because it's a quarantine, because they may have less physical mobility for when they do, if they, would need to go out to go shopping or something like that. And also just because the way our movements are often structured, older comrades are very frequently marginalized. We might, call them up when we're interested in some talk about a struggle back in the 70s, but then sort of forget about them in the day-to-day, or not establish the same intensity of friendships with them. So it's been very important to remember to in touch with those folks, calling them frequently and making sure they're all right. Also because just how on the one hand, how obvious it is, but also how frequently it's been demonstrated that that isolation, social isolation is really bad for your health. Mm-hmm. And old people especially have get a lot more health problems when they're socially isolated.
So I'd love to bring up and touch back on the rent strike idea that you said. You mentioned that folks are getting like some support in mortgages, but that people have been talking more and more about the idea of rent strikes and withholding, and in a society where squatting is a lot more normalized, even if it is criminalized, than what we experience in the U.S. Like I'm especially interested to hear what those sort of conversations, what they sound like in Spain. Like how I know that Spain has been suffering for a long time economically. It's been pretty depressed, or my impression is, like, talking about the country as a whole, and especially with impositions by the European Central Bank. People have been living in a ever-increasing sense of austerity, like economic austerity, for well over a decade. Can you talk about the suspensión alquiler ya and other pushes to get rent suspensions, and what possibilities you see there?
Definitely. So you're correct about the economic situation. The general feeling throughout the Spanish state is that the economic crisis of 2008 never ended here. So the recession that's starting now it really just feels like a continuation of that. Unemployment had remained high. Precarity definitely shot up. On average in the Spanish state, people actually pay even more than in the U.S. in terms of the proportion of their salary that goes to rent. But it's higher here, but still fairly similar. So especially folks in the U.S. who live in like the larger cities with really expensive rent can imagine like a similar situation where easily half or in some cases more of money that you make has to go to paying rent. And specifically with tourism that has racked a lot of cities, there's just been a huge shortage of housing, as so much of the housing market goes to goes to tourism, goes to
like Airbnb,
shit like Airbnb. Yeah. So even before the pandemic started, it was really reaching a critical point with housing precarity, lack of access to housing. So when it all started, the government announced that there would be a suspension of mortgage payments. Didn't announce anything for renters, and so then you had a situation where discussion was circulating about a rent strike. The need for a rent strike was, I think, obvious to nearly everyone who rents. There was news coming in about calls for rent strike in other countries. A lot of the more specialist organizations focusing on housing, however, already had their calendar of their sort of action calendar, which was made before the pandemic. And they were having trouble kind of coming up to speed or adapting to the new situation. So it actually took a lot of work getting support, not from renting people, but from housing organizations to support the rent strike. But in the end, finally, in time for the April 1st call out, more than 200 organizations supported the call for the rent strike. Of course, because it's decentralized, rent strike is by nature decentralized, so it's impossible yet to know exactly how many people are participating in the strike. But by all indications, definitely thousands or tens of thousands of different apartments are withholding their rent, have declared favor for the rent strike. So you mentioned one platform, Suspensión Alquileres Ya. Which rent suspension now, and that was a coalition of a few different organizations that specialize in the housing movement, trying to pressure the government to announce a suspension of rent payment. I think they sort of underestimated both the urgency of the situation, the amount of precarity and poverty that most regular people were facing. And also the maybe like how easily the government could co-opt that demand, and so actually pretty quickly the government started circulating the news that they were going to announce a rent suspension. But of course, the government's rent suspension was partial. It would be on a case-by-case basis or dedicated to whom the government deemed to be the most vulnerable people, which of course didn't include the actually most vulnerable. It wouldn't include people without papers. It wouldn't include people who already were unemployed before the pandemic started, and so on and so forth. So it was really, really just like a shameless attempt to try to co-opt the slogan of rent suspension. Fortunately, finally, all those organizations, or most of them anyways, began supporting the rent strike. And in the end, the program that the government announced was basically just an open invitation for people to go farther into debt. What they announced was would get interest-free loans, microcredits, and they would get more time to pay back their rent. Fortunately, everyone realized that was just a total slap in the face. The rent strike is currently spreading. People are figuring out ways to get the word out, even when we're on total lockdown, when we can get arrested for going outside. So people will, make, handmade posters at home, and when they're on the way to the supermarket or the pharmacy, if there's no cops around, they'll, throw one up quick on the door outside an apartment building. We talk with our neighbors. There's the pots and pans, the noise demo from our balconies every evening at 8. So, we can shout out to neighbors and stuff like that. But, a rent strike is not a short-term struggle. It's not something that's, that's won overnight. It's, probably going to be something that lasts for 3-6 months or even more. And certainly the consequences, if they try to evict people, that will come once the lockdown is over, 3-6 months down the line, a year down the line. So it's a long-term commitment. Also, throughout history, nearly all rent strikes have started with a relatively smaller group of people that then spreads. So one thing is how many people are striking on April 1st, but another more important question is how many people are striking on the 20th of April, how many people are not paying rent on the 1st of May, on the 1st of June. So yeah, we're in it for the long haul, trying to spread it as much as possible. One thing that's interesting, I mean, obviously, capital functions internationally, like the way that huge multinational vulture funds and real estate interests have been buying up property in Barcelona. I know the same thing has been happening in the big cities throughout the US, throughout Canada. Like, it's completely vital to have an internationalist perspective. I mean, I come from the US. I know that, we're taught to believe that we're the center of the world. So often there is, even in anarchist movements, a bit of a nativist approach to politics, like only focusing on the US, occasionally looking to Canada. And then, of course, if you're going to look elsewhere, look to Europe. But still, it tends to close itself within this US framework. The things that have happened to the housing market over the last 10 years have absolutely been international. And also governments tend to use the same repressive playbook. They learn from each other very quickly. And also non-governmental institutions, the media. So the media campaign that y'all are seeing in the US as soon as talk of the rent strike was circulated, oh my God, the small renters, there are all these people, poor people who only have, 1 or 2 or 10 properties, and they're going to be absolutely devastated if there's a rent strike. The exact same media playbook was used in Spain. And so that's also something that that we've had to confront, and that's what the government does. They try to break up the great mass of exploited and oppressed peoples into different parcels, into different sectors, and of course everyone faces very different kinds of oppression based on a whole host of different systems of oppression, from racialized oppression to gender oppression, economic oppression, and so forth. Of course, it is all very, very particular and very specific. But the way that the government will announce measures only for people with mortgages and ignore people who are renters, or maybe announce some kind of rescue package for renters who entered the unemployment rolls after the pandemic broke out, but not the ones who are already unemployed before the pandemic. It's designed to divide people, to make people who lost their job now think that the people who had already lost their jobs are just lazy or they deserved it somehow, or make the people who managed to get a mortgage fear the moment that they might have to return to the unwashed masses of renters. It's very unfortunate when activist organizations through these single issue approaches play into that kind of division or segmentation of the exploited. Unfortunately, that's something that happens. And so we definitely need to be creating perspectives and practices of solidarity, generalize as much as possible, that reach as far out as possible, creating solidarity across different segments of the working classes, and also definitely across borders. This is a global rent strike. I mean, it's international anyways. It's working on being global. That's the first time in history that's happened, and that's really vital. Capitalism functions in an international way. Governments support each other internationally. So we need to be supporting forms of rebellion that jump borders. And also throughout this, we need to be thinking about what we can do supporting comrades in countries where they have an even lower number of ventilators than in the US or in Spain. To think about questions of what does decolonization mean internationally? What do reparations look like? What does solidarity look like? I mean, because currently the way that the media talk about what this pandemic is going to look like in the global South, the few times that they ever talk about it, is really disgusting, and definitely reinforces the sort of nationalist discourses that have an impact all over the globe. So hopefully that's something we're also thinking about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Pivoting back to the concept of disinformation. Around the U.S. and the American centric perspective, particularly prevalent among conservatives and the right in the U.S. There's been a lot of disinformation about the nature of the pandemic, the danger that it poses, and the strategies to slow its spread. And this has come from a few different quarters, including obviously like people in the current administration, executive, and as well as a number of state and local governments around the country, and also from certain segments of the media that just a lot of the media about what exactly we're facing and how to prepare for it. And I think that's really hamstringed communities' ability to approach this with clear eyes. Have you seen this sort of phenomenon of like widespread misinformation in Spanish society, or like are there people in Spanish society who are anti-vaxxers or some sort of analog to that, who are having chickenpox style parties about COVID-19? Maybe not at this point, or does that seem like a phenomenon that's pretty like specific to the U.S.?
I mean, let's see. I try to keep up to date on both like U.S. media and Spanish media. There's definitely differences. Similarities would be, I mean, there's misinformation everywhere. People who are on Facebook, who are on whatever social media, they're getting like, a large dose of what they're getting is just, someone like shooting off about, their personal image of or personal opinion of what's going on. I mean, if the average of those people shooting off are more intelligent than Donald Trump, hey, that's something, but not much. So, like, what I'm seeing in like U.S. media and U.S. social networks is that the disinformation tends to be more directed on nationalist lines. I think just because so much of like the ruling class in the U.S. is gearing up to this kind of geopolitical showdown with China. And so a lot of what's happening is being digested and interpreted within the framework of a competition with China in terms of, how effective China's response has been to, straight up, xenophobic, racist, Trumpist kind of discourse about, the Chinese somehow being responsible for the virus. So disinformation that's circulating from what I've seen in Europe is a little bit less conspiratorial and less politically directed, although there definitely is a lot of stuff, coming from the left, coming from the other side, about, China supposedly had a really great and wonderful response to the pandemic, super effective, or that Cuba has like a miracle drug that cures coronavirus. Different things like that are definitely circulating. And yeah, so that's I mean, it's worrisome when on the one hand, racists are taking advantage of a pandemic spread largely by tourists and business people, by the way, to try to vilify, to demonize like an entire country, entire ethnicity, and then it's also problematic when governments that base their response on regimes of total surveillance that are now technologically possible, then get sort of like a free pass or have their response romanticized. Purely in terms of effectiveness. That's one of the problems. I mean, anytime you get a specialist take on any societal problem, you're going to tend towards technocratic solutions, because a specialist take is actually usually going to simplify just one criterion or just a couple criteria. So in something like a pandemic, you'll look at infection rates, or maybe even death counts. Leaving aside the possibility of how easy it is to manipulate infection rates in order to play to the media, especially at a time when most people aren't getting tested. So, how people get counted as to whether or not they're infected is questionable. The whole question of only taking into account infection rates or death count doesn't really address the question of health in all its complexity. It doesn't address questions of other effects to people's health when they're locked up in their houses. It doesn't address questions of, we don't know this for sure yet, but it certainly seems likely that COVID-19 is going to become another part of the human ecosystem, the way the flu is, a more deadly flu without a doubt, but something that is going to be a part of our biologies. It certainly has the characteristics that would make that a possibility, that it's not going to be something like SARS that's can be gotten rid of, but that it's going to be basically circulating among us for the foreseeable future. So in that case, it wouldn't really be justifiable to subject everyone to total and complete surveillance, so that at every time you know where they are, who's sitting next to them, and all the rest, for something that's going to be a part of our collective immune system, a part of our yearly cycles of getting sick and in most cases getting better again. So that's worrisome also when you can reduce everything to just one criterion, one input, and justify any social response whatsoever on the sheer grounds of bringing that statistic under control or what have you.
It's been interesting to hear how media is digested, like the example of South Korea, for instance, tracking people by their phones and then alerting people that are whose phones are nearby that they've just come into contact with someone who has diagnosis of COVID-19.
Yeah.
Or the robots that were deployed into certain cities in China, that I guess not only were broadcasting out messages of stay in your home, but I imagine also had cameras on them. Or the robots that have been deployed into Tunisia, which I don't know that much about, but I guess as a part of they've been ticketing people if they come across them in public somehow, I guess identifying them, and I don't know. But yeah, I could see the logic of the technocratic state taking this as an opportunity to standardize this approach of the new normal being the crisis of disease, and needing to further restrict and not only needing to further restrict our emotions, our movements, our relationships with each other, but trying to inculcate that into us as the new normal.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, a fear that many of us have who see a great opportunity in the slowing of the economy and a building of bonds outside and against capital and state logic is that because right now, it's true, there are all these negative effects, and not to valorize the positives that you can take out, but we kind of have to take some positives out of this. And this is forcing a lot of people to slow down and sort of rethink their relationships to work and to their means of living and to each other and what community is. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity to be taken out of that for those of us that make it through this round. And so I think that this is accompanying fear that what we gain, what we learn, will be pretty easily dissolved after this first round of the disease, or that the state of exception will expand further and never retract. You kind of mentioned this already a bit, talking about the rent strike and having to build up over the course of months. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the long-term sustaining of the muscles that we're building now and international connections that we're trying to grow.
Well, first off, I want to say that I think your framing is right on. I mean, in any kind of healthy rhythm of living, sickness is an opportunity to slow down, to reflect on possible causes, on possible weaknesses. Because within a healthy community, you're still going to get sick sometimes. Sometimes getting sick is a signal from your body to slow down, to fix something. But also it definitely needs to be said that, a healthy community dedicates whatever resources are necessary to helping people heal, and it doesn't, let you die on the side of the road because you don't have insurance or something like that. So that's obviously not the situation that we live in, but a vision of a way that we could live. So I think it's absolutely important that people take this time to reflect on what's actually essential, what's vital, what does health mean, why do we all work bullshit jobs that are actually not at all necessary. So as for what comes after this, I think, change, it's cyclical, it comes in waves, but also kind of like in like fits and starts. I think change is, if you look at it from up close, is less often like this very smooth curve. So, for example, when police use whatever excuse to get like a whole bunch of new riot equipment or like, armored tanks or something like that, you're not always going to see that at every other protest, right after whatever state of emergency that they use to get their new toys. But they do still have them. They'll bring them back at some point. That's maybe one example people might be able to relate to. I don't think this pandemic is going to immediately destroy the capitalist imaginary of the last 2 decades. I think there will be still this large tendency from governments, from business leaders, to get us to go back to normal, to celebrate the end of the lockdown by going out shopping and all the rest. So I think there will be on the one hand this splashback towards these normal behaviors, like freedom in the liberal capitalist sense of this individualistic shopper's paradise for those who have any money in their pockets or a credit card or whatever. So I think that we're facing a situation that this will smoothly transition into an authoritarian regime where the military are already are always patrolling the streets. But I do think it's definitely jolted and shifted the sense of what's normal, the sense of what's possible. It's practice for the police, for the military, for states, for us, if we get used to it, if we are complicit in normalizing these state powers that are being brought out. The police are definitely enjoying the hell out of it. They're all living their zombie apocalypse fantasies. It's going to affect their behavior in the long term. And then the rest of it depends on a lot of things. The European Union is in a moment of crisis, in which they, like in the past few years, they've had some major setbacks in pushing this vision of a united Europe that's both democratic and technocratic. And those setbacks have come overwhelmingly from right-wing nationalist government projects. That's part of the reason why the European Union is getting hit pretty bad. Why a lot of the epicenters of the pandemic are here. Why from a state point of view, the response has not been very effective in Europe. But among the governing classes and the technocratic classes here, the lesson is very clear that that these right-wing nationalist projects are a big obstacle to increasing the power of the state here. So I think governments in the European Union will be more receptive to the kind of technocratic models that are being rolled out by countries like South Korea, China. The U.S., on the other hand, even though it's at least in the global north, is almost certainly going to be the hardest hit by COVID-19, I think it's just so locked into its death agonies, like the final years of the U.S. empire, like this completely ridiculous, unwinnable dispute between like a sort of resurgent ethno-nationalist tinged neoconservatism, duking it out with centrist democratic neoliberalism, neither of which have intelligent answers or really any answers at all to what's going on. Like both of them are living within these political debates that became obsolete at least a decade ago, if not two. So I think the political class in the U.S. is just completely incapable of dealing with this in a progressive way, progressive from the standpoint of like progress and the power of the state. So I think the biggest residues there will be in normalizing the practice of disaster release, of emergency response, FEMA, military, police, and all the rest. Which, and you know, in the end, like crises and these sort of new phenomena, they never bring out new things. They just sort of bring out the elements that in retrospect were the most dynamic elements of what came before. So that, I mean, that's how the government was responding to Katrina. That's how the government was responding to Ferguson. So it's not really a coincidence by any means that, you know, this is also its response now. As far as what we can take away from this, I was going to say I'm very hopeful, but that's a lie. I'm mostly pessimistic, but very enthusiastic in my belief that our chief hope is in taking how we're responding to this and moving forward with it, spreading it, breaking borders, making this international, and from there making it truly global. It's worrisome how little, or rather, it's worrisome the limits that have appeared to the internationalization of struggle in the past couple of decades. There are definitely examples of struggles that have jumped borders, insurrections that have jumped borders, or at the very least inspired and strengthened movements elsewhere. You know, with the Arab Spring having repercussions, of course, well beyond Northern Africa and the Middle East. One thing that was really promising in the U.S. was, even though it was certainly limited, the ways that people took the uprising in Chile, which is a very, very important movement, as an invitation, as inspiration to start movements for riding public transport for free throughout the U.S. That, I think, was a really promising direction and certainly a really beautiful moment. When capitalist crisis is completely global, it's completely interconnected, and at a moment of global pandemic, it's the most promising moment to also make our struggles and our forms of resistance global. If we can't do it now, we probably won't ever be able to do it. So that's one thing, this outward perspective, this outward expansion, which I think is absolutely vital, and of course was certainly something that had already started before the pandemic. Like I mentioned, the example between Chile and the U.S., or the way that people were really learning from the rebellion in Hong Kong, things of that nature. At the same time, I think that that outward expansion, if you will, needs to be accompanied by a very long and honest inward gaze at the things that we were doing terribly before this. Largely in terms of putting mutual aid into practice within our own networks, taking care of one another. I think we were doing a really shitty job of that. I think in most places, every time that I've gone back to the U.S. in recent years, this feeling has been abundantly confirmed, also being confirmed over here, of just this absolute silence and growing distance between people, alienation, isolation, just this absolute growth of how capitalism has taken over the minutia of how we communicate or don't communicate with one another, and just the fact that it's spreading everywhere, I think, really demonstrates how this is an outgrowth of capitalist anti-culture, if you will. And so, I mean, whatever we build in these new rebellions is all going to be shit if the basis is rotten, if the basis is still just egos, alienation, isolation, and a real lack of caring in practice between people. So I'm pessimistic because that's the reality that I see that's beneath most of our projects. I mean, that can change. Everything can change, but I don't think it's going to change unless we're a bit more honest about very low quality that some of our activities have been plagued by, largely seen in how we treat one another.
Sort of on the topic of international struggles that support has been crossing borders for, and also that folks have been trying to engage with intellectually, is definitely not perfect, definitely not anarchist, but a lot of the movement in the self-administered regions of North Syria, otherwise known as Rojava, I feel like the conversations that I've heard and participated in concerning the efforts there to grow something different, and possibly in like good faith because we've feel a lot of affinity for the former anarchists that that helped to influence some of the thinking of their ideological leader. But like I've been inspired a bit by what I've heard about going on there and talking to people that have returned from Rojava. One of the takeaways from conversations that I've had has been that we, as anarchists and libertarian socialists and whatever, anti-state, anti-capitalists, one thing that we've been lacking in our communities, and I don't think this is just limited to us, it is like a wider thing within society, is like you said, like poor reflection and poor accountability to each other. And I wonder if you've had a similar experience interacting with folks that have gone to Rojava, maybe trying to like bring something approaching Tech Mill back to their community engagements or what have you.
Yeah, definitely. Personally, my primary experience with like, other more caring way of doing things would be with some solidarity projects in South America. I would say that as far as Rojava goes, I've without a doubt noticed among women comrades who have gone to Rojava and come back this like a much greater capacity for support, for creating more communal relationships, solidarity, also at this deeper level that I was trying to describe. And I mean, I just based on honestly ignorance and my own very very distant view, I would guess that transformation has a lot to do with like the maybe deeper quality of the women's struggle in Rojava and genealogy. That's to keep with a positive. I'll focus on that. It's obviously a complicated situation, with lots of different nuances, but without a doubt, I think when people get the experience of seeing, I mean, in at least, speaking as a white person from the U.S., whenever I hear other white people, definitely from the U.S. and in general from the global North, use like the word community as like something that like actually exists, I think that usually they're like lying to themselves. Like I don't think we tend to actually have those, but like I think experiencing like an actual community can really be like a wake up call for like, wow, we actually are all in this together. We survive together. We hold each other up. So it's we learn that there are ways to stop acting like bastards in our everyday lives. It's not easy, but it is possible.
And I guess to kind of close with this other prompt around like liberatory possibility and how we might come out of this stronger. I wonder if for folks that are still putting a lot of faith in Comrade Bernie, if you have any suggestions about if you think that there's actually hope that voting for Bernie Sanders will alleviate the stresses of post-COVID capitalism. I think I know the answer.
I didn't realize he was going to be on the ballot. So when I lived in the States, I didn't have healthcare. Not having healthcare sucks a lot. Here not initially, but after I got residency, Spanish residency, I now have access to healthcare, and there are a million very valid critiques to make of government welfare, to make of Western medicine, to make of public healthcare. But it's still way better than not having anything. So like, I have total sympathy for people who have some idea in their heads of how they're going to fight to get universal health care for the U.S. Survival matters. It's certainly not everything, but it matters. Just in terms of the realism of that goal, we've had like actual left-wing parties in power in Spain, and they helped with the austerity measures. They helped get rid of or decrease the quality of healthcare. Syriza in Greece is way more left-wing than Bernie Sanders, and they passed like the harshest austerity measures in all of Europe. But then even if we just look at the U.S. reality, I thought that as COVID-19 spread through the states, I thought that it would actually happen in time for Bernie Sanders to win the Democratic nomination. And the fact that it didn't slow down Biden's rise at all, and in fact, as soon as it was evident that the battle was largely lost, Sanders started losing support even faster. The fact that amidst a global pandemic that's going to have probably the highest death toll in the richest country in the world doesn't change the electoral system, doesn't make any dent on the electoral system, such that the only candidate who's talking about universal healthcare can't even get the nomination of the supposedly left-wing party, to me strongly suggests that elections are not at all an instrument built for responding to popular needs. So I would just ask people to look at, what kinds of activities actually bring results that make a difference in people's lives, and maybe stop wasting their time.
Thank you. So you published a number of books over the years, all of which can be found pretty easily via, for instance, AK Press, your more recent one. Are there any ways that the listenership can keep up on your thoughts and your writing that you want to share?
Let's see. I try to make sure that all my stuff is up for free on the Anarchist Library .org. And if you're not on Twitter, I really don't recommend it. Stay away from social media as much as possible. I've recently started experimenting with that. So those of you who are already lost souls like me and are on Twitter, I have one of those things, and so when I publish new things, I'll send out a link. But above all, when you can go out in the streets again, support your radical bookstores, support your radical publishers, and if you don't have any money, by all means, take it for free. And so it's on the internet.
Peter, thank you so much for taking the time and making this conversation happen. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for keeping your show going and doing a whole bunch of awesome interviews.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.